Welcome to the Dr. Dad's podcast, where a naturopath and chiropractor come together each week to share lifestyle medicine, health advice, and inspiring interviews with some of the top experts in health and wellness, bringing you the latest in nutrition, exercise, ancient healing, toxins and detox, your microbiome, mindset, hormones, brain, and much more. Stay tuned. We're going to teach you how to experience growth daily.
Hey everybody, this is Dr. David Wardy coming at you with Dr. Nick Jensen, and we got another great episode coming your way. The last episode we were talking about the body ecosystem hierarchy, and we started with number one, as I discussed, if anybody caught that episode, with the extracellular matrix. And today me and Dr. Nick are going to break down number two, and then maybe even number three. We're going to get into the brain and the immune, aka / the lymphatic system. Dr. Nick, how are you today, bud?
Doing well, man. I told you we just got back from a vacation, so today's day one in the clinic. And when you're away for even a week, it's like, you're kind of scrambling a little bit.
I know the feeling, buddy.
Yeah. So I feel like it's a busy day here too, and running from one patient to the next. There's different needs that people have. I mean, I'm sometimes blown away how we just keep putting on different hats as we go through the day. Sometimes we're a technician. Sometimes we're really, compassionately listening. Hopefully we're always compassionately listening, but I just find that people need different things. And so you have to be very adaptable. And it's funny when you're out of the rhythm of that for a week and then you jump back in, it's kind of like, oh yeah, this is what I do every day.
Oh yeah, man.
It's a bit of a shock on the system.
It's like getting back into chameleon mode, right?
Right? Yeah. That's a great way of describing it.
I know exactly what you mean, bud.
Yeah.
Well, and as it should be, right? Because if we weren't doing that, that means we'd be doing like cookie cutter stuff on everybody. That's not how it works.
Totally.
Right.
And I find like the conversations that come up with people when you, and again, maybe it's when you just tap back into being present. Like I really feel like being a doctor really forces presence upon you, because I know you do this too. You can read the signs that the patient is giving you, that's sitting in front of you, and they tune in if you're slightly checking out. I'm like, wait a second, I'm not being present here for this person. And then once you anchor in, I find that just the quality of the conversation changes. I mean, this happens obviously with your partner or your family and whatnot too, but it really forces you to be present, because ultimately you want to win for the person that's sitting in front of you, and you want them to realize that for themselves. And but yeah, being a chameleon is part of the job. It really is.
I love what you just mentioned, man, because I do these little workshop trainings for my employees every week, and I find even if it's just 10-15 minutes to teach them something.
Mm-hmm.
And last week we were talking about presence, and I'm big on presence because the work that we do in this clinic, you have to be very present to have the result that we want to have, when we're having table time with a patient. And I was telling him, I said, when you look at presence, there's really multiple layers to presence. I was like, so I'm going to give you like another layer to start thinking about when you're trying to be present with somebody. I said, so one, there's just being aware and giving that person the space, right? And holding the space and being with them, right? And being tuned into them. That's the first layer. The second layer I told them is, what stream of consciousness do you want to bring to that environment, right? So like, I showed them, we've talked about, is it David Hawking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hawking, right? Yeah. I showed them that chart we've looked at, right, with the levels of consciousness. And I said, look, if you're going to be in that person's space and you're present, but let's say that day there's any kind of negative levels of consciousness running through you, negative emotions, things like anger or grief or sadness, things like that. I was like, you're actually going to be disrupting the patient on the table with the energy that you're bringing to the space. Mm-hmm. And so I show them those upper levels, right? Like, so past courage, you have acceptance, willingness, joy, peace, love, all those things. And I said, so imagine being able to be so present that not only are you present with the patient, but you have a stream, I call them heart streams, of either love or gratitude, right? Or joy, whatever you choose to have when you're sharing that space with that person. And what could that do for that person? So the way I show them how this works is I will have them muscle test like one of the other employees on the table, and we'll find an indicator muscle that's strong. And then I'll tell them, okay, I'm going to come up to the table and I'm just going to bring a lower frequency. So I tapped into hate, and then the patient would go weak on the table. And so I'd say, you see, and then I went all the way across the room, but I would still stay in that state. And the patient is still weak on the table. And I said, you see how I can be all the way across the room, but be in that state, and it's still affecting you on the table all the way across the room. And so then I had them raise their consciousness to a place of like love, right? And joy. And immediately it negated me. And so I showed them, I said, when you're at that level of energy and you're in that amount of expansion, just like we talked to, who was the facial diagnosis guy, where he said one act of love knocks out 4 haters, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of reiterated that lesson. I said, you were in a state of love and I was in a state of hate, and you were able to knock out my frequency, and I was right next to the table when you did it. I was like, so the amount of energy and the amount of presence, and like you just said, how deep do you want to go with your presence? There's a lot of power in that, right? And so I thought I'd just share that just because it is important. And if people if people would think about those things, I even told them, I was like, this goes beyond the clinic, guys. Like, this goes when you're just around your family, like you just mentioned, or your partner, or like, let's say you're around somebody who's not having a good day. You could change their day just by stepping into their field and being in that state. I was like, totally. Raise their vibration. I was like, their body almost will harmonize with that upper energy that you're bringing. So very cool stuff.
What a great teaching moment and experience for your people to go through. Like I think maybe many of us that are in this sort of space of healing, we maybe have, been exposed to muscle testing, or maybe through heart math or some of these other types of technologies, understood that, or had an experience of that. But what a great tool to show the people you work with, so that it's not uncommon where someone comes in and they have a terrible day, and someone might, that frequency, that energy might kind of rub off on someone. You might just take someone at face value and go like, oh, that person's a jerk, or they're not friendly, or what have you. But really what you're offering them is to actually, well, if you just came from that place of love, or change the state that you're in, you're probably going to have an impact on that person who walked in the door in a certain way, but now they're actually leaving with just maybe a hint of something more possible for them.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's amazing.
Yeah. And the other piece there, man, just to wrap it up, is there's a law of thermodynamics, energetics, and it's the amount of presence that you have with someone or something is directly proportional to the amount of effort you're going to have to put forth. So the more present you are, the less effort it takes.
Yeah. It's huge.
And so it just goes to show you like how much energy are people draining all day because they're just not present, and like they're just losing energy. And for our listeners, you only have so much energy every day. You wake up and it's like a battery, and there's only so much, and the body will utilize the energy that it needs for vital function demands and keeping you alive. And then whatever's left over is at your disposal to either burn through or to efficiently use it throughout the day. So yeah, it's a big one.
That's huge. Well, it directly correlates with sort of this hierarchy that we're speaking to, right? Because so much of that bandwidth and ability to regulate is dictated by how our brain is doing, right? Our nervous system and our brain.
The master system.
So dive in, like, why is this number 2 on your list? We talked a lot about the extracellular matrix and the fascial networks, and definitely if you haven't listened to that podcast, go back one episode to tune into that one. So how are they, maybe like, why is that the next on your list, and how are the two connected? Because there's definitely synergy between the ECM and
absolutely, yeah. So those are both communication networks, right? We talked briefly last time. Cellular matrix is much faster than the brain as far as processing and moving energy and information through the body. But the reason brain is number 2 is because if we have any kind of trauma to our brain, anything major happens to our brain, and we're in really big trouble health-wise, right? This can cause major problems. The littlest brain issue can cause, you can die from a brain problem, right? I had a scare a couple of years ago with my dad. He had a pituitary adenoma. Freaked me out, man. And then I found out that tons of people get these, and it's a real common thing, and they actually have surgical centers because there's so many people that have these problems. But it's a serious thing, right? Like if something goes wrong there, you're going to have a lifelong problem, right? You could be handicapped with something. So the brain It's our master system. I preach about this system all the time. This is our broadcasting system. Okay, you're at home, you turn on your TV. If you can't see anything on the screen, there's something wrong with the broadcast. Well, your brain's your communication network. It's constantly feeding and processing everything that it's reading from your environment from a sensory aspect. So you have what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you taste, right? What you smell, and all that sensory input constantly is being fed into your system, and then your brain has to process that along with your mind. And then all that hodgepodge has to come out as a motor component of how we interact with our world. And so you look at the brain and you say, okay, well, what kind of things go wrong here and how does it affect the whole, right? And so there's the other big reason. It's number 2. So we talked about the way the ECM affects the whole, but let's talk about the way the brain's going to start to affect the whole. Well, when we're under chronic stress and our nervous system's tipping too much towards this fight, flight, or freeze type tone, we're going to get in trouble when this becomes chronic. When it's acute, we usually can be adaptive and we can have that reactivity to get back into that flow of that, parasympathetic mode where we're calm and relaxed, but we're alert. But when we're chronically getting into this mode where we're in this sympathetic overdrive all the time, that's actually what starts to cause the problems for us. And the brain, just like any organ system, right? It's going to start to struggle if it's being overstressed. So the way I break this down, and interrupt me, man, please, as we're going through here if you have input. So one of the big things I always talk about, I start with people, is just the 2 tones of our nervous system, right? We just talked about it, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I explained, like what I just said, when we're chronically stuck over on this sympathetic tone, this is where we're going to start to have problems. So when we lose reactivity of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, this will cause a lot of disruption in the brain, different parts of our brain centers, from the prefrontal cortex. You have your visual cortex, auditory cortex, you have your motor cortex. I mean, just think of all the other parts of our brain that have to work cohesively all day long to help us just adapt and be who we are and show up. So the moment we're stuck in this chronic state of stress, we lose integrity of something called the prefrontal cortex of our brain. So the analogy I like to give, because it just simplifies it, imagine you're at an orchestra, right? And you have the conductor guy with the 2 little sticks, and he's up there in front of everybody, and he's doing his little movements. And all those instruments sound perfect, right? You can hear that beautiful symphony from the orchestra, and that music sounds amazing. Well, for us, when it's that way, we have good stress resilience, we have good emotional resilience. It takes a lot to rock the boat. We're very, very resilient. We can show up to life and we adapt really well. But what happens is when we're stuck in that fight or flight too long in that chronic stress, you lose integrity of your prefrontal cortex. Now, your prefrontal cortex, this is your executive function. This is thinking about thinking, logic and reasoning, pain perception. This is the guy that kind of runs the show. He's the conductor. So that chronic stress causes that conductor to get drunk. So then he's going to start struggling a little bit, and he can't keep those other brain centers organized, and they can't stay in coherence, which they can't stay connected. And the moment that happens, then we start to have problems. So the way that's going to show up for an individual is, number 1, it's the opposite of what I just talked about. You lose your stress resilience, you lose your emotional resilience. It doesn't take much to rock the boat. You get irritable, okay? You lose conscious control of your emotions, which actually causes more of a downhill spiral. So when we lose conscious control of our emotions, so these can be things like anger, frustration, this can be overcaring, this can be panic, this can be fear. The moment we lose that conscious control of those types of emotions, then here comes more mental stress and emotional stress, because we're stuck in that stress and we can't manage our own stress. So this starts to just snowball more and more problems with the nervous system. And then as that's translating, we all know how that feels in life. What happens the longer we're there? We're going to start having issues with our energy and our sleep. The common thing I get from people when they're in this state is they can't turn their brain off when it's time to go to bed, and they're stuck in their thoughts, or they're waking up in the middle of the night and their brain's like running 100 miles an hour. And I know our listeners, everybody, it's just happened to everybody, including me and Nick. You're asleep and all of a sudden you wake up and then you're already thinking about the next day and your brain's running 100 miles an hour. And you're like, why am I already thinking about all this crap? Or you're thinking about stuff in the past and you're just stressing. It's the middle of the night. You just woke up from a dead sleep, right? So that's another common thing you will see when this is happening. So when the brain loses integrity or coherence, like I say, there's just this snowball unraveling, man. And then we can't adapt really well. And then the longer you're there, like I'm talking, for some people, this is short lived and it's not that long and they can recover. But other people, they're here for years, buddy, or like months. So imagine being stuck in that state for months. So then you have this, let me just keep going here, okay? And you can add to me. So then after the brain goes with the stuff I'm talking about right now and the mental stress component, then you have your hormone problems that are going to follow that. Why? Well, what do your hormones do? Well, it's called the neurohormonal backup system. Their job is to kick in when we're under stress to help us deal with stress. So the longer we're in that fight or flight, the more our body's going to be shunting cortisol out to basically deal with that stress. So then you have pregnenolone on the up, right? Because we're shunting all of our resources to that cortisol. And then we're going to have issues with our pituitary gland, anterior posterior pituitary. Our adrenals are going to start to struggle, so you can have adrenal insufficiency. That's more from like what we call the general adaptive syndrome over time, which we'll talk about if you want. And then after the adrenals start to go, you're going to see issues with potentially the thyroid when this is chronic. And then even for women and men, this is going to affect gonads and ovaries because it's going to affect the entire endocrine system, right? So you get this cascade of the hormones doing their job first, but then the longer you have to stay there, if we're in chronic stress, then the hormones are going to start to struggle. So the way that shows up for us as individuals is you're going to get tired. You're going to notice there's fatigue present in your day, and you're not having enough energy like you normally have. You're going to notice sleep disruption. So you'll start to notice there's issues with sleep. You're not waking up rested. And then you're going to start to notice things like brain fog, anxiety, depression. All these things start coming when the hormones start to struggle. So there's a lot that happens once the brain starts to struggle. Okay, I could keep going, man, so I'm going to stop here because I'm sure we'll talk about some of the things, but I hope that kind of just painted a picture for people why our brain is so important in the hierarchy of systems, and why when we're not feeling well, you have to go upstream and address the brain for everything else to get well. Because I could have structural issues at local tissue or muscle things. I could have hormone issues, right? I could have a lot of these downstream things happening, even with my gut. And if my brain is still out of whack, it's going to continually cause that problem because the communication system's off, the broadcasting system's off, and it can't communicate efficiently to the body to get these mechanisms back into balance. So the way I'll simplify that for our listeners is everything has a rhythm in your body. Every organ has a rhythm, every system has a rhythm, and then all those systems are working together in a rhythm. So dis-ease in our body comes when we're out of rhythm, when we lose that biological rhythm. And the moment these rhythms disrupt, one of the biggest rhythms that needs to be in coherence is your brain. Because if that one's off, all the other ones won't come back online the way they need to. So the brain's number 2 for me, man. That's why it's number 2.
Yeah, that was beautiful, buddy. Like, just seeing all the integration, because I think so many people, when they go see a doctor, they're talking about their symptoms, which of course they are. So that could be insomnia, it could be, hormone disruption, which maybe is like dysmenorrhea for a woman, or like, painful periods, irregular periods, or for men, they might be like feeling all the symptoms of low testosterone, sleepiness, not able to put muscle on, not feeling that vitality. All the different symptoms that one might feel, and yet we're being managed by the symptoms. So the doctor might put you on a antidepressant or painkiller or something to reduce inflammation, and we're just so far away from the source of what we need to correct. Something you said in the last podcast, which was I think really interesting, or something loosely around this idea that the extracellular matrix is a reflection of the soul, or in the sense that it's like a manifestation of the mind even, and it's more like the energetic side. And when we talk about the brain, often we like confuse it with like our thoughts and our thinking and our mind to some degree. And really it's kind of like the receiver, or a communication tool. It's interfacing with thought and mind and everything, and then it's refracting, reflecting, and processing through this instrument, which is compromised as a result of these other things. And so it's not uncommon that we don't think well of ourselves, or we don't interact well with others, or we feel less than, or we feel all the things that we feel just because there's this massive disruption in how these two fields, the mind and the brain, are communicating. So yeah, I love the picture you painted for people, because it really correlates. Like, oh, you don't have a hormone problem. You actually, you got to go further upstream. You got to get to, really, how are you regulating? How are you communicating? One other thing I'd like to say too on this point is that, for a lot of people, what you just described, that happened in childhood. Like, it's not something that just happened in, perimenopause for women, or andropause, or, in their 20s or 30s. Like, there's been a version of that probably going on most of your life, and there's some really interesting studies called ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Event Studies, to look at the propagation of someone who's had childhood trauma, or even head injuries and things like this, and the kind of disease manifestation that shows up for them, like much higher rates of suicide, to depression, to insomnia, to abuse, or other things that will manifest later in life. And it's because that brain's been dysregulated for so long. So it's wild to think of just the impact that this is having on multiple different systems.
Well, and I'm glad you said that, because I have to tell people this all the time, because I think people know how important it is and the weight of it, but I don't think they understand how important it is to address it actively. So, like, we're talking about the mind, right, and how it affects the brain from a mental, emotional capacity. So I could have trauma, like you're saying, whether it's childhood trauma, or let's say I lost a loved one, and I'm grieving, and there's a lot going on, but there's some form of trauma taking place. So if I don't have an active role in dealing with that trauma, I'm going to be left, like you're saying, with an onslaught of just what that trauma ends up doing to my nervous system, and to my mind, and to my brain. So from the standpoint of a kid, for example, like what Nick's talking about, is I could have these emotional traumas growing up from the time I'm a newborn to age 9, let's just say. And the way your brain functions is every single thing that happens with that trauma, the mind remembers and puts into a memory bank. So there's going to be association as we move forward through life with whatever those memories ingrained with that trauma. So anything that happens in life that faintly is close to the environment that you were in when you had that trauma will trigger your nervous system to go into that same tone. So think of like your nervous system has like this antiviral software. And so you're building your hard drive from the time you're born to about age 9 in your subconscious, and all of that mapping of your brain is going to basically be your hard drive for the rest of your life. And as we go into adulthood and we're growing up, a lot of times we're going to get triggered by things that were associations with things from our childhood, but they shouldn't be stressing us out, right? But our nervous system is still going to behave that way. So like what Nick's saying is, you're setting yourself up for this long-term disease process, honestly, globally, when you have emotional mental trauma that hasn't been dealt with. And that's what these studies are probably showing now, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
And then you look at somebody, let's say it's not a childhood thing, but let's just say you're in your 40s and you lose a loved one. Well, let's say I don't deal with that grief properly for 2 years, and I'm stuck in depression for a 2-year period, and I don't have an active role in dealing with that grief. You're damaging your nervous system. You're damaging your brain, because the mind is very powerful, and the mind will override the system, and it can put us into dis-ease, right? So I always tell people, like, especially my people that are grieving, I'm like, you need to go get counseling. You need somebody to help you go through the grieving process, because it's not a matter of if you're going to grieve, it's how long are you going to grieve, and how long is it going to take you to move through this efficiently to where you're always, I think people always grieve, but they heal from the grief a little bit to where they can move on with their lives and it's not causing a negative impact. And it's sad, man. I see a lot of people that have trauma like that, and they don't have an active role in it, and they're like 2-3 years past the trauma, and they're still like it happened like a month ago.
Yeah.
And they don't understand how bad that is affecting their well-being.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the grieving has a few different stages to it. Like it's like denial, and then there's like the aggressive phase, and then there's like what's the next one? It's something about like
What is it? It's anger.
yeah, anger,
It's
denial.
sadness, anger, denial. No, sadness, denial, anger, and then acceptance. Right? Something
Yeah,
like that.
there's like another one in there where it's
Uh,
like making deals. Like, oh, if I do
okay.
this, then or if only this, then this.
Yeah.
But eventually, yeah, you eventually move to acceptance. But something that I think that's important here is that like many of us are just accustomed to suffering, and so moving into acceptance is it's a really wide gap for
Yeah.
so many people, and you know, to the point of this dysregulated state that we find ourselves in, maybe just, you know, from 0 to 9, where we're getting a lot of that programming, we might have learned the lesson that suffering is how you move through life. And I mean, I would say it's kind of like, you know, labeling someone as someone who is someone who's depressed, like you are depression versus, oh, I'm experiencing the symptoms of it. You know, in the case of like grieving, I'm experiencing suffering. The symptoms of suffering and all that it entails, but I'm not someone who's identifying as suffering or whatever you want to call it. Like I'm recognizing this is a state that I'm in, and I can move through this, and I don't have to constantly orient myself through suffering in order to get through something.
Right.
Um, and so I think, yeah, grieving and suffering are potentially two different things.
Yeah, man. I mean, and you probably see this, huh? Like you, when people are sick, I always go back like 2 years before they felt really bad. And I say, well, what was happening in your life before this all started happening? And buddy, you can always trace it to like a big traumatic event in their life almost
Yeah.
every time. Almost every time. And like, so we're back to the brain and the mind, right? Like it all starts with the brain and the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah.
there's a snowball effect that comes because there wasn't an active role and they just kept living life, and then their health started to struggle. You know, it maybe
Yeah.
starts with the hormones first because they're constantly in this fight or flight, and their hormone system starts to break down, and then this is causing issues. You know, like we talked brain, but this causes long-term issues with neurotransmitter balance in the brain, and you know, like we just talked, like you have the pituitary gland and you have the hypothalamus. I mean, all these things start snowballing, and then you have a systems problem.
One of the last pieces, I mean, you mentioned some cool stuff earlier, just around what you did, like what you do sometimes, give a teaching to your people. And I think identifying like this connection between what you're choosing for yourself, or as in like maybe running a new mental program, and how that can change state for someone else. Just the power in that, like, so that there's this real merging of maybe more ethereal or like energy with a physical matter, which I think is super important, because the physical matter essentially is that expression of the hormones or the neuropeptides or whatever else is getting signaling into the body. And I was going to say one other thing just with regards to that learning process. I think so much of our capacity to move forward is limited based on our previous experience. I think we don't like show up in a new moment and going like, hey, wait a second, this is new territory for me. What's something new I can learn here? Like what do I have yet to discover? Like how can I sort of not lean on my past, so to speak, and that we often move through things just based on our previous experiences. We don't really tap into what else is possible for us. And I think that's that gap right there for most of us, including myself. Like I think that many of our decisions just come from what we've done before, and not really tapping into what else is possible. And I think this is sort of the re-entry point for the mind. How can we use the mind? Like this is Joe Dispenza work, right? How do we use the mind as a vehicle to like reprogram the brain again in a different kind of way, a way that we have yet to discover for ourselves? And I think like this is where like we start to find our way with re-regulating. And then
Well,
like last thing I'll say on that is just that part of the tools that we use electrically is neurofeedback. So this is where we can get re-regulation in the brain, so that is matching this new state that's possible for the mind. Because when the electrical capacity of the brain is disrupted, and say, like you said, you're not accessing your prefrontal cortex, and you're stuck in that limbic system, and you're not really engaging that electrical system to the prefrontal cortex. So if you can reroute the nervous system there, and then bring in this new patterning for your mind, through counseling, through energy work, through breath work, through meditation, through visualization, through like really engaging that, I think this is where we start to close that gap. And then obviously fill in the nutrition, fill in like the hormone optimization. There's so many things that help to bolster that up. But I think that's like a way to bring it full circle, is like it's from mind to brain, and then brain back to the mind.
That was perfect, man. Because that needed to be said, and you hit it on the head when you said state, right?
Yeah.
What I want people to understand, what Nick just said, is it's a state, not a trait. And everybody knows that. When we're not well, we know it's not a trait. We know that we're in a state that does not belong there. We're out of rhythm, and we feel it. That's what everybody feels, right? And you can't find the right traits again if you don't get in the right state. And what these things do, like Nick's describing, whether it's neurofeedback or it's NIS or it's chiropractic or you're getting some other kind of brain mapping work done, it helps rewire and reconnect the brain to put you back in the state that enables you to navigate the mind the way you need to. Because unfortunately, I love it that you said this, man, you cannot navigate your mind properly when you're not in the right state. That's probably the best way to describe that.
Yeah, 100%, man. I think that was the cherry on top.
It's just impossible, right? Like you can't navigate the mind, and you can't find those aha moments or those moments of insight or the healing or the epiphanies or whatever that is that you're looking for, like Nick is saying. That is not available to you when you're not in the right state. And that's what the beauty of these tools are, man. It helps get the state change so you can get back into that state that is necessary to start making the necessary changes.
Yeah, I mean, extreme examples would be people in an addictive cycle, right? Where they're so deep in their behavior, and they're so deep in that state, and they're so deep in that identification with like, this is just who I am. Like we kind of mentioned that with regards to depression and suffering. And this is just who I am. This is like we're so quick to label ourselves. I call it the observation versus meaning, like the OM formula. We're either observing like, oh shit, I feel really crappy right now. Things aren't going well, whatever that might be, whatever that dialogue is, that observation. But then we're just so quick to give it meaning. And so then it's because I'm a depressed person, or it's because I'm an addict, or I know that's a charged word, of course, but it's because of this. We're quick to label that trait on ourselves. And so how do we actually access a different state when we know this is who we are? You know what I mean? And that's like Ryan Holiday, the obstacle is the way. Like what stands in the way becomes the way. So how do we like move through the obstacle by being okay with the obstacle being there? And that's having access to changing the state. Because I mean, we change our state all the time. We change our state when we're sleeping. We go from obviously alert to unconscious. We're in a different state when we're just coming out of our sleep. So these are different states that we find ourselves in. But we can do that with breath work. We can do that with getting into a cold plunge, right? We can get that into just doing a hard workout, going for a long run, or, doing some rucking, or, we can change our states faster than we realize. And then if we apply that on a regular basis through breath work, meditation, or like you said, NIS, chiropractic. I know I would come off a chiropractic table too. I'm like, I just feel better.
Oh yeah.
And it's like, can we just celebrate that we feel different? Right.
Yeah. Well, and like anybody who's been to a chiropractor will tell you, right? When you get a good upper cervical adjustment, it's like a hard reset. It's like somebody hit the reset button on your computer.
Yeah.
And you feel it immediately, right? I mean, it's almost immediate.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, I mean, it's so important. So I'm glad we kind of wrapped that with the solutions, right? The solutions are finding the state change and finding tools to help you utilize basically you're just leveraging, like you're saying, it could be lifestyle habit leverage, or you go to a practitioner that does these things for you, but you're finding something just to help you get back in the state, the rhythm that you know you're supposed to be in, so that you can, you know, start evolving and growing, or making the changes necessary to heal, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, I just had someone earlier today who's so identified with her anxiety, and so, like, I mean, there's people who are anxious, and there's people who are like really, really anxious. So when we're doing neurofeedback, I mean, she doesn't want me to leave the room. She wants to make sure the door is open. Like, there's a real need to keep the environment safe, right? And it's so interesting how quickly we guard that state, right? Like, we want to protect it because it's the only thing that we know. And so part of the, like, the education for this individual was that your brain is going to re-regulate into a new way of being. And so there's going to be this electrical change, neurological change that's happening in your brain, but your mind is still over here. Like you talked about harmonization, right? Like integration. When the brain is starting to learn a new behavior, that's going to feel unsafe. It's going to feel new because again, we always reference things to how they went in the past. I mean, this poor individual had a really nasty concussion. But since then, it's like, this is the person, this is the trait, this is the person who she is. And I just want to give like a real life example of, like, it's crazy how intense it can be. And then when we see like one of the things that she ended up sharing was, like, she was able to go out to a restaurant, and there was like noise and like an environment that would typically really trigger her, because the bandwidth for someone that's so deep in their pain and their suffering and their acuteness of, like, how it feels acutely, even though it's become a chronic issue, it's terrifying. So to see that she had a little more space was like, this is new, this is really, really new. And that's part of that, I think, mind recognizing, oh, like, things are a little different, but they better not be too different, because if it gets too different, that's too new for me, right? So I think, like, our mind is really good at just sort of keeping things safe enough. So there's just like I told her, it's kind of like we're fluffing up a pillow. We're just giving a little bit more space for you, a little bit more bandwidth, a little bit more awareness, so that you can sort of push up against those boundaries of what typically in the past might have felt very uncomfortable. And now you get to sort of nudge up against that and recognize you got a little bit more time there. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've got a ton of patient stories like that, but I thought it'd be like helpful to just to see, like, how the integration actually happens.
Right? Oh yeah, and it throws them off, right? Because, like, it surprises them. They're like, yeah. Oh, I win. I didn't even notice it until I noticed it. Right? They're like not even conscious that it's happening until they really, like, look at it, or you have to mention it. They're like, oh yeah, I was able to do that. And it's literally because, like you're saying, the brain's getting rewired, and it allows the mind to actually work more effortlessly, right? And be more in sync with the brain. But it's crazy, man. I mean, it's amazing how much, when the brain starts to struggle, the mind will unravel really fast. And then, like you're saying, some people can't get a grip on their mind, and they're so far in that sympathetic tone that they're so anxious, man. And then you have the other side, right? You have some people that are so stuck in parasympathetic, and they're just like bottomed out, depressed. Yeah. And so this goes both ways for our listeners on the brain end. It can be, so much anxiety from that prolonged, sympathetic or prolonged parasympathetic, where you're so depressed you don't even want to get out of bed, or you don't want to even get up to do anything for your family or whatever that may be. But yeah, I mean, that's the power in a lot of these things, like what Joe Dispenza is doing with his meditations, and some of these other practitioners, is they're showing how powerful the mind can be and how it can override the brain when you do things like breath work and meditation and use these type of systems. And I love Dispenza because he's testing everything, and it's all verifiable through blood work and brain mapping and all these things. And he's showing, this is what's actually happening when you do my meditations that I'm teaching you. And we teach you how to, like, get into gratitude and these other types of things. And I use his stuff all the time, man. But I always tell people when they're really sick, I'm like, you can't be the same person you are right now and come out of this and be healthy. You're going to have to change who you are.
Totally.
You have to be a new person coming out of this, right?
And that's what scares people, right? And that's kind of what I was saying, where we're so attached to that trait that we've identified with that trait, that anything outside of that feels scary, and it feels like a lot of work. I find people do that with pain too. Like they're so deeply identified with their pain, and then when the pain's gone, they forget that they had pain. And it's just it's just fascinating to think of like how protective our entire system gets, like obviously our brain and our mind. But one other thing, like I know we were going to maybe jump into lymph too, but I think something that's really important here. And again, we brought up Joe Dispenza. We talked a little bit about heart math, but this sort of like feedback loop that happens from the heart to the brain and through the testing of, or like the measurement of heart rate variability. So I thought it might be worthwhile to sort of just share that, because this is part of that master computer, the heart to the brain.
Well, let me just explain it this way. So I have an HRV at the office. You have one too, don't you? Do you have an HRV?
Yeah, it's heart math. It's way less sophisticated than yours. Yeah.
So I've got a neat HRV system, and basically what we do is we run 300 heartbeats on people, and we look at your heart rate variability. And the reason we use this tool in my clinic is because you can get a really good look at the autonomic nervous system through heart rate variability. So this system has algorithms that it takes you through like 8 different screens. It shows me everything from your heartbeats, and if you have arrhythmias, PVCs, things like that. Then it goes into the autonomic nervous system. It shows me sympathetic tone, parasympathetic tone, and then it shows me neurohormonal regulation like in a pie chart. So it tells me where you're tipping, right, on the seesaw. It tells me if your nervous system's in balance. So if your autonomic nervous system's in balance, central nervous system. And then it'll even show me how much you have left in the tank, basically if we get hit with like another stressor. It shows me metabolism. I'm able to look at like your brain and actually see what brain state we're stuck in. So we're able to look at delta, theta, alpha, gamma, and beta. And then we can look at things like hormones and minerals. And anyways, to wrap it up, what Nick was trying to explain is the heart-brain connection is immense. So like when we do a scan on people, we're looking at the heart and person just sitting there, they're in a pretty chill environment, right? And we just have them we tell them, close your eyes and just breathe and relax. And so the office isn't a stressful place, but it's interesting what you'll see on that heart rate variability. These people are in a very neutral space and they get horrible scores when they're not well. Their nervous systems are whacking out. So you pull these people's scores up and they're a high sympathetic tone. There's very little parasympathetic. And then there are neurohormonal backup systems like off the charts, and it's overworking all day. And you'll see inflammatory factors up, and you see all this imbalance. And then you can actually have them go back, do this test again. And there's a little thing on the screen that shows like a bubble. And there's some apps like this where it has you take like an inhale and the bubble's expanding, and then it'll exhale and it shrinks. And you'll take the person through the exact same test again, but looking at this bubble thing while they're breathing. And then their heart rate variability improves almost immediately. And so it shows this integration with our breath and how it actually will calm our nervous system down and how it changes the variability of our heart rate. And so that just goes into looking at things like breath work, which is involved with meditation and all these things you see people doing. But it's really neat to see how impactful that stuff can be, like if people would just do it more regularly, right? Like it's very impactful. Breath work is powerful stuff. And if you can have a tool like we have, and there's I think they have tools now, like I think my Whoop Band, you can actually do some breath work, and you can look at your stress index now, because this one runs HRV all day. So that one's actually pretty cool. But there's tools available now that we can readily do this on a daily basis when we're getting really stressed. And it gives us those biomarkers to tell us where our nervous system's at.
Yeah. I mean, you like you said it, man. Like, I think because, and going back to what we said before, not to beat a dead horse, so to speak, but this is that trait versus state thing. You know, like we know that breath work has a profound effect on our state, and it's measurable. Like this isn't just some, oh, you should breathe. Like it's actually impact. It's the one thing that we have conscious and unconscious control over. I think it's probably one of the most vital of all of our systems. Like we can only go a few minutes without breath. We can go many days without food, and then, you know, less than that with water. But breath is like, I mean, we've done podcasts on this before too, but it literally changes that whole. I think it's like the tool for integration between that mind and the brain. It's one of those things that has such obvious impact on that HRV. I mean, what a powerful tool. So if people just did that, you know, even 3 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day, or when you get into a state like that, I think like we're just not giving it enough attention that it needs. I know for me too, like if I'm having a couple of stressful days in a row, or if I'm feeling sick or whatever, I'll put on a yoga nidra session, which is basically just like sort of a passive lay down, or it doesn't have to be just laying down, but passive meditation, or just tuning in, listening, or it can be brain tap or something like that. But it's such a great reset. I come out of that just feeling recharged again. It's like a mini nap, but it incorporates, you know, body awareness and breath, but it can be less than that, much less than that. Yoga nidra session might be 15 minutes. You can literally do box breathing or the heart math, or that heart coherence breath for, you know, 3 to 5 minutes. And you're getting real-time information to show how quickly it's changing your nervous system. I mean, it's powerful.
Very powerful. And then like Nick's saying, I mean, it's number one, doing it, but knowing when to do it. Don't wait too long to do these things. Like if you get stressed out one day, do it the same day, like before you go to bed, or, you know, if you have time after a stressful event, sit down for a couple minutes and just do breath work for 3 minutes. That little bit can downregulate your nervous system and pull you out of that fight or flight, so you're not sitting in it for hours.
Yeah.
Or even days, man. Some people, it's
Isn't
days.
it crazy? Isn't it crazy that we make excuses though?
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's the simplest thing you could do, and it's probably the last thing you're thinking about when you're in the middle of a crisis, of course. But I mean, you're getting better oxygen flow into your brain, so you're going to be able to think more clearly. You know, obviously, you're going to be able to re-regulate that cortisol upswing. You know, so much changes in just such a short period of time.
One of the biggest thing it's doing, man, is it's working with your vagus nerve. So for our listeners, your vagus nerve is one of the main nerves that helps you regulate the autonomic nervous system, that sympathetic parasympathetic tone. It helps that seesaw have balance. But when you lose integrity of your vagus nerve, that's when you're going to tip from one side to the other too much. So breath work, one of the things your vagus is in charge of is your breath. Your vagus regulates your heart rate, your breath, your inflammatory response, and it innervates all your digestive glands. So if you can tap into your breath and regulate it, it actually will stimulate that vagal nerve tone, which will put you back into that parasympathetic tone to pull you out of that stressful state. So you're tapping into like one of the main parts of your body that helps you regulate that when you do those things.
Yeah.
Just like the cryo, like you were talking about cryo earlier. Cryo is great to get a hard reset. I got to tell a quick story about cryo just because it's such a powerful tool. People that do it know it. But if you haven't done it, I'll tell a quick story. So my brother, he was just in a really bad place, man. And his stress levels had gotten so high that his anxiety was like off the charts. And he lives in Florida, and I'm all the way over here in Texas. And so my mom calls me. She's like, "What do I do? Your brother, he's so anxious. He's talking about suicide, and all these things are going on, and he's not well, and he's just all over the place. What do I do?" And I said, "Well, how long has it been going on?" And she told me. I said, "Well," and it was extreme. It was really bad. I said, "Well, let's do this." I was like, "Tell him to go buy about 6 bags of ice, throw them in the bathtub, fill the bathtub up with that water, and just tell him to sit in the bathtub as long as he can, and do that for like 2 or 3 rounds for like 3 or 4 minutes." Buddy, he had been in that state for probably like 2.5 weeks. After he did that, completely pulled him out.
Wow.
Like one session in the bathtub of like just freezing his ass off, completely pulled his nervous system, and it pushed him back into parasympathetic tone. And then he was able to manage everything after he got that. So dude, cryo is very, very powerful for regulating the nervous system and getting you back into that balance. So yeah, I mean, these are great tools, man. I mean, and they're, like you're saying, breath and cold water. Come on, everybody. Those don't cost anything. I mean, I know there's all these companies selling cryo tanks now, but I mean, you don't necessarily need to do that. Do a cold shower, go bag some, if you want to do it at home, just buy some bags of ice, throw them in the bathtub and fill your bathtub up. I mean, it's very powerful just to help make your adaptive systems have to shift a little bit.
Yeah. What a powerful experience. I mean,
oh man,
hard to hear that too as a brother, just knowing that your bro's going through some
yeah.
heavy times, right? Like, but
Well,
wait,
yeah,
like that's a change in state right there,
state
right?
change,
Like,
yeah.
huge.
And I knew that's what he needed, right? So like I couldn't help him because I'm in Texas. So I was like, what can I have him do that he can do at home that will just completely make his state change? And that was it. That's all he needed. He needed a state change.
Wow. The thing about what's happening there, like you're getting interface, like you're a total wake up of your extracellular matrix. Like it's having to massively adjust.
The whole system. Yeah.
Right? And then your breath, you're like you're taking a huge breath in to deal with that stress, right? There's so many mechanics that are happening. And then going back in, like the mind of like, I'm going to go in there, like I'm going to do something really hard and I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it again. If you had them do a couple rounds, I mean, there's a lot of stuff there for integration.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a great story, man.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, even it's, you brought up something just briefly before where you're saying like, people can get stuck in that parasympathetic state too. And, we know that like dopamine, if we were to say that would be a massive surge of dopamine by doing cold plunge, it's possible that he might have been more dysregulated in the parasympathetic side and he actually needed something to like move towards. We know the dopamine gets more, it's like this, it's an activation or release in anticipation of a reward. So we're going to be doing something really hard. Hopefully on the other end of that, it's going to be something positive. But that's a huge surge in dopamine that he's going to get from being in that experience and then testosterone and other things. Right. Massive shunting of blood flow, change in that cortisol rhythm. Like there's so much going on.
It's powerful, man. So powerful. And it's funny because, I mean, we talk about ancient healing strategies. They've been doing this forever, right? Forever. Yeah. And now we're in 2023 and people are buying these expensive, dunk tanks and all this shit. And you have people, I mean, and it's this fad, but it's not a fad. Like it's always been there. It's just now people are actually waking up. And I think the reason it's happening so much is we have a country of very stressed out people, man. Yeah. And that's why it's getting such notoriety, right?
Yeah. You got a tank though, don't you?
I have like a makeshift tank. I bought it one of those big like Rubbermaid tanks that they use at farms and stuff, and I'll throw ice in there. But we're actually gonna do some improvements to the house, and we're gonna add a tank in the backyard. Maybe two tanks actually, a hot and a cold.
On a cold, yeah.
Yeah, a hot tub and a cold tank. But yeah,
can't wait to see it. I mean, David's also upgrading his clinic to expand his vitality lab. So yeah. For all of you that are local for David, it's pretty interesting to use some of these adaptive or these hormetic type of technologies, the red light, all the stuff that you've got in your lab. And then, this is someone who's practicing what they preach. They've got it at home, right? Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
Sauna does that too for me, man. Like sauna is another state changer. Mm-hmm. It's another extreme temperature fluctuation that your body has to adapt to. So these are simple yet powerful tools, right?
So I think that's a good place to wrap it, buddy, because we haven't given our home play in a while.
Oh, that's true. Let's do it. Is it a cold plunge?
So I'm going to give home play today. Let's not narrow it to a cold plunge. Let's just say for our listeners, what can you do this week that you can start maybe implementing habitually that creates a state change for you? So it could be cryo, it could be an infrared sauna,
breath,
could be breath work, could be meditation, could be neurofeedback, whatever you can think of that we can add to that list. Start getting in the habit of creating a workout, right? An intense workout, right? Yep. Yoga, something like that. What do you do for state changes? And then start rating your state changes. How powerful are they for you? Mm-hmm. Maybe you need to add some that you haven't tried before. I love cryo, man. Yeah. People are the people that are most afraid of it get the most benefit. I will say that. I will say that.
Yeah. So true. It's funny. We were in Portland, or the Oregon coast, and beautiful there. Like the sandy beaches are. There's something out of a picture book. It's just gorgeous. but the water's cold, man. It feels colder in Oregon than it does in the northern coast, like we're off the coast of Vancouver here. It's freezing, and that was our cryo session. We're jumping in the waves and dunking under, and had the kids come in. It was amazing. So if you're near an ocean, that could be, and you're hesitant to go in, go for it, man.
Or a cold river or something. But yeah. It's fun. It's fun. Yeah. Remember when we were at men's camp, we jumped in that pond? It was the cold water, pond. Buddy. That was cold, though. It was cold. Yeah. Yes. Oh, it
was awesome.
And there was a giant grizzly like 200 yards away from us in the field. That was fun.
Then we wrestled him, right? That was part of the hormetic response.
Yeah. It's part of the treatment.
That actually didn't happen to everyone, but if it did, that would be a story for sure.
Yes. There was a bear there. There was a bear.
Yeah. All right, buddy. So good to see you again. And
you too, brother.
I'm excited to hear, if any of you guys reach out and share what you did for your hormetic challenge or your state change challenge. We'd love to hear. We know that, it's been impactful in our own lives. So it's always nice to hear stories from what people are noticing in their own. So
absolutely.
Buddy, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Until next time, brother.
Yeah. Adios.
Adios, bud.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please be sure to subscribe to the Dr. Dads and share with your family and friends. You can also follow and interact with Dr. Nick and Dr. David on Facebook and Instagram for a daily dose of inspiration and the latest in health and wellness. Be well.